What we would like to do in this particular panel is to invite our younger generation to basically comment on how the house of God is perceived by them and members of that generation. And we will take audience questions after the presentation. I just want to introduce them in order. There's Dr. Otto Chebly. She's a recent NYU Medical School graduate, one of my students, as I recall, very, very well, excuse me, is currently a resident in primary care, internal medicine at NYU. She's actually doing this all and recently becoming a mother. Kate is at work on her second book. She's already published one successful book. Dustin Brinker is a medical student, one of our recent medical students. He's already co-director of the NYU Free Clinic with a deep interest in writing and medical humanities. And Eli Cahan, also one of my students, is now a medical student, but he's conducting a year of research at Stanford University, but he will be back. His superb medical essays have already won prestigious literary awards. His work has appeared in Scientific American, among other prestigious publications. Dr. Otto Chebly, or Kate, I will start with you, and I'd really like you to talk about how essentially the house of God is perceived. You obviously have read it carefully. I think you probably took the course with Shem. Yeah. So just in other words, how does it resonate with you today? And then I think we can get into some sort of discussion before we take questions, given the fact that there was an awful lot to chew on in the panel before, include talking about feelings of your generation.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to join you. So I actually didn't get to join that seminar, but thankfully have been able to spend a lot of quality time with Shem to get to understand more about the implications of House of God and this next House of God 2.0. When I first read the book, I had not even started medical school yet. So I had a career in global health prior to coming to medical school. So I arrived at school very idealistic and really here to want to make a difference. And I remember when I read that book, I had a very hard time reading it at first. I thought, like, this can't possibly be what medicine is like. This isn't what I was going to expect. And I just couldn't believe that that was actually the case. And so it was actually difficult to kind of get through that book and stomach a lot of what was there. I love books like Catch-22, but I imagine someone who's a patriotic soldier maybe doesn't appreciate all that satire as well. So the first time around, it was a difficult read. And then I went through medical school, have started residency, have reread the book. And it's very interesting how a manuscript can kind of transform after you've had certain experiences. So although I do think being an intern and resident today, in 2018, is very different than what it probably was at the time of the House of God, I think there's a lot of themes that still resonate with the experience of being an intern today. I think in particular, what I most appreciate about the House of God after this second read, I think, is this idea of the importance of being critical and being self-reflective in order to make your practice better. And I think that was the spirit of the House of God, was a reflection to think of how challenging some of these experiences were, not just to say how challenging they were, but because you believed in something better and that it could be something better. And so I reflected a lot on that in my own practice and in my own life as an intern and now as a resident. I agree with the statements before that one of the most challenging things about being a young physician today is the electronic medical record. To give you some perspective, so I just came from Clinic Now. I have 5 patients scheduled in an afternoon. It's booked for 20 minutes each visit. You know, my last patient who came in was a middle-aged man who is living in a homeless shelter, has coronary artery disease, hepatitis C, and is trying to be sober from heroin. Imagine, like, just that package of a patient. Imagine that you have to spend at least 5 minutes on just some of the technicalities of a medication reconciliation and clicking through some buttons, another 5 or 10 minutes on putting the note in. That essentially leaves you with 5 minutes to actually talk to a patient if you were to follow those rules like that. So that's challenging. A lot of our patients don't speak English, so you can imagine having a translator phone makes it take even double the time it normally takes. So what I choose to do is I just choose to spend my time with the patient. And if I stay late and write notes late, then that's fine. But this is someone who I'm seeing for the second time, this patient. I asked him how his Thanksgiving was, how his grandchildren are. We sat, we talked. You have to develop a trusting relationship with someone if you want them to even think about following any of the medical advice you offer. So to some of the points made earlier and to the spirit of the house of God, I think it's really important to, I guess as the fat man would do, is to kind of break the rules or just do what is actually right and not necessarily what is indicated. On the inpatient side, if I can just very briefly, that can be difficult too. When you're in the inpatient wards, traditionally the way a day goes, or when I started medical school or internship, how it goes is you come in, you pre-round on your patients, you probably spend 5 to 7 minutes max with each person, just checking how the night went, and then almost the entire rest of the day, you might be at a computer. You round with your resident, you round with your attending off into the computer, you're putting in orders, you're calling consults, you're adding medications. So if you let your day go like that, it will go like that. And can you imagine being at the hospital for 14 hours and spending 5 minutes of it with each of your patients? That sounds bizarre as the house of God seemed probably to some readers at that time. So again, I think there's plenty of ways around that. I think our residency program in particular is wonderful and very open to new ideas and doing things differently. A lot of attendings now will choose to try to do bedside rounds instead. Now that I'm a resident, I actually ask my interns not to pre-round unless people are very sick. So I ask them to sit at the computer for 1 hour in the morning and get all their computer work done, and then we spend the rest of the day actually seeing patients together. So I think if you want to and you think creatively, you can work ways around it while still respecting the expectations of what you have to do. But it's a challenge, and the current way things go can be really bizarre. So I think there's definitely a lot of application to what the House of God presented, and I think if we consider the House of God a piece that asks us to be self-reflective, I think it's very relevant to being an intern today. Sorry if that was long.
So before getting up here, I had intended on going into a thematic analysis of the novel, as a young academic would probably be wanting to do. But I think, as you can tell, I'm probably going to be one of the youngest people to go up on this stage, and it's a very humbling experience for me. So to that end, I think it would be much more appropriate to talk about the personal aspect of the novel and dive into those themes of connectedness for me. So I was the first in my family to have the opportunity to go to college directly out of high school. I was also the first in my family to ever get accepted to apply all the process of going into a medical school. So that influences the way that I think about this novel in many ways. My first year, last year, I dealt with a lot of issues concerning connectedness, especially being a humanist, humanities-driven individual in a field that's heavily dominated by science. In many ways, it was difficult for me to connect to my classmates in a meaningful way. That all changed for three main events. One, I started to become more involved in our student affairs staff here, wonderful people, great staff. Two, I became the co-director of our free clinic, something that has greatly impacted my perceptions of what it means to be a student. And three, I read The House of God and had the opportunity to take Shem's seminar. So before this year, having read bits and pieces of the novel, I actually would not have recommended anybody my age to read it. However, going through the seminar, talking about the themes, and really hearing the experiences of those around me, I see the importance of it, especially regarding aspects of the abject and interconnectedness. So as I begin my medical journey, it's hard for me to imagine what it's like beyond the classroom and into the wards. And this book was what allowed me to really take a glimpse into that realm. And I think to that end solely, and based on the conversations I've had with my classmates, it is a timeless piece in that respect.
Thank you. Eli?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Oshinsky and the rest of everyone putting this on. It's a huge honor. Responding to Dr. Kaplan, sorry, and thank you for your mentorship at 4 a.m. in the morning. I guess that can happen. That's a phenomenon that exists these days. So I think I feel endeared to this panel very much because it's a group of role models that I've had for a very long time, which has me feeling here like a bit of an imposter. But I think that's also where the House of God comes in, because in some ways it resonates with all of us, and to the extent that it resonates, it helps you not feel like an imposter. I think the book has a very difficult legacy. I don't think it's ambiguously or unambiguously good or bad, but I think it forces you to think, and it forces you to ask questions. And if, I guess the hashtag that I'll pull up is trigger warnings, it's a very triggering book for very different reasons to a lot of different people. But sometimes I think that's what is needed to shift a system or shift a practice in big or small ways. So I don't think that you can argue, I don't think it's a valid argument that everything in the book is true, but I think to say the counterfactual that nothing is true is equally false. I think that it's undeniable that there are truths, whether or not they're factual or emotional truths, that persist with this book. And I came in very close touch with them. Maybe through my least favorite law is law number 6, which is there's no body cavity that can't be reached with a 14 needle and a good strong arm. And on my first day on the wards, when I'm handed a 14 needle and pointed towards a body cavity, I wonder the strength of my arm, and I think that truth resonates. And so, I agree with so much of what Kate said. I think maybe the big adjective of this book for me, as I read it the first time and then took the seminar again, and there's a saying that, you read this book multiple times over the course of a medical career, and it means something different to you every time, and you are furious at the book for different things every time, and you're thankful that the book exists for different things at various points in time. I think the adjective that persists regardless is cynicism. And I think, like Kate was alluding to, wonder if that's such a bad thing. And on the point of advocacy, I think it takes cynicism to observe the holes, the voids where there might be something, or the places where there are something where there best not ought be. My favorite saying from the book is, don't just do something, stand there. Observe, think before you act. You could apply that literally to one of the other crises that I spend a lot of my time thinking about in my research, which is overutilization and misutilization of testing and that sort of thing. But I think that if there's one thing to blame the system for, it's that it's just taken away a little bit of the time to think about how you would best approach your practice. That's the biggest challenge for me that I saw in the wards when there were so many correct answers and less conversations about the answers. The last thing I'll say is I think this book endowing me with a sense of cynicism that there were areas of medicine that not only could you be critical about, regardless of your level of expertise or not, but maybe you should be critical about, is the idea of narrative in medicine. And I think at the end of the day, that's what every patient interaction is for me, a story. Shem said in one of the seminars, you either have a nonfiction brain or a fiction brain. You don't have both. I don't know if that's 100% true, but I think to the extent that a book like The House of God forces you to create characters out of people and imbue people with character, then that's an amazing thing when you're interacting with the janitor at 3 a.m. in the morning, that you can imagine a person beyond the janitor at 3 a.m. in the morning, or whether it's your patient who is non-compliant because they can't afford the taxi to the hospital, or whatever the other barriers are, which research has shown the most dangerous 3 words in the universe. Research has shown contribute disproportionately more morbidity and mortality than sometimes biologic factors. So those are some of the
Okay, I'd like to ask the first question. When Shem was talking, he was talking about connections then and now, and I noticed there was some conversation among you as he was speaking to that point. I was just curious. I think his feeling may be that those were tougher times. They were in the same boat, and they had to connect and talk much more frankly and closely. And I was just curious as to what the connections are in your lives with your colleagues and particularly your contemporaries, and just to talk to that briefly. Kate, if you would start.
Yeah, absolutely. So briefly before I answer that, so the book I wrote, my first book, is called Everyday Ambassador. It's about the idea that in a world that's more digitally connected than ever before, we end up being a little bit less humanly connected. And I think if we look at our own culture and society over the past several years, we can see that a lot of technologies tend to make us more divisive, have misunderstandings. For all the good that there is in these technologies, they can also sometimes cause side effects. And I think that the same thing can happen sometimes in the workplace. So it's not intentional, but again, if you are expected to do certain things by the end of the day in order to get home at a decent time, and a lot of those things require you being on a computer, you will sit there and do that, and then you're not spending a lot of time with other people. And I do think there's some generalized deterioration of some of the skills needed to have meaningful, thoughtful relationships with people, especially people with whom you might disagree or not have the same background. And yet, in medicine, I think that is one of the most important things, is to be able to connect with people regardless of their background, both your patients and your consultants and colleagues and other people you're working with. So, I mean, I think I love coming to work every day. I have lovely colleagues. I love the time I spend with them. But I feel like I'm in a program that believes in the importance of that social connection. It makes an effort to try to have us be connected outside of just work, but even when we're at work, I do see a lot of, I've seen role modeling that I try to role model now, of people who make efforts to, you know, when you're on the inpatient wards, make your team really feel like a team, and if you all need to, you know, go downstairs for 15 minutes in the afternoon and get coffee together, you do that so you can get back to the grind. And it might be a different type of workplace than it was a while ago, but I generally think, or my experience in this program is that there's really great social relationships, but I do think we're challenged by the idea of having to be really deliberate about pursuing those and nurturing those. It's not something that's kind of handed to you, that you just have lots of time to sit and talk.
I would like to direct a question at Eli. As you know, one of the beauties, I think, of this medical center is that it really is also a center for writing. We have an enormous number of people who are really superb medical writers for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, JAMA, and the like. You are all taking that path to some degree. And Eli, directing this toward you, I was wondering, in a sense, not only are we talking about tradition here, but we're also, I think, talking about the impact of writing and the narrative on your own view of medicine. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an amazing place to be interested and passionate about that slice of the universe in terms of developing a voice and using a voice. And I think the way I see that is what Dr. Sharon said, which is, you pull the levers you have. And when you're below the totem pole, you don't have many levers, but sometimes if you shout loud enough from the bottom of the well, someone can hear you. And I think, and maybe it's because I'm the younger half of a twin brother, but I've done a lot of shouting from a lot of wells. And I think that's the outlet that I have. I think I think Kate spoke about this idea of micro advocacy and sort of treating rules as guidelines and recommendations sometimes or seeing a little bit of ambiguity to express yourself or do things the way that you believe is right. I think that writing has provided the outlet for me to reflect on the experiences I've had and try to mature into a more vibrant person, physician, and writer. And I think that the very act of writing forces you to fill the space on the page. There aren't really any shortcuts. And I guess you choose to include details or leave out details. When you look at a painting in the Met, there's nothing there by accident, right? Like they still drew the rose in the bottom left corner of that painting. It was the same pigments probably that went to the facial structure of the person in the spotlight. And I think the forced inclusion of details and interpretation of details when I was writing patient histories is something that came up just as readily as when I've been writing the other part of my writing. And I think that the solicitation of details also is really such a core component of medicine, right? Because they say 85% of the diagnosis can be made in the history and physical. The challenge of a history is you have to take it, it's a communication and you have to know the questions to ask. And I think writing and investigative journalism has helped me develop an ability to ask questions and just to unpeel the onion.
Thank you. Eli unpeels the onion very, very well. His writing is absolutely superb. Sometimes the onion is enormous, like getting 18,000 words down to 8,000 words. But your stuff is really extraordinary. At 4 a.m. in the morning. Dustin, you're just starting out now. I am of the belief that all things are not politics and activism does not have to center exclusively or even primarily around politics. I was just curious, as you are starting out in your medical career, in terms of activism, and what do you see? In other words, what really strikes you? What interests you? What do you want to get done?
So one of my biggest goals in starting this journey is to actually completely revise the medical education system. So I have a pretty strong background in student affairs and leadership development and teamwork development, and I think that current medical education does a really fantastic job of preparing our physicians for the content that they will encounter later on. But I think that a lot of the teamwork, professional identity development, that sort of education is shifted more towards the graduate medical education realm, more like residency, internships, fellowships. And I think that we are doing a disservice to our students in that respect. And I think that in the future, I think we need to be more deliberate with that. And I think that in itself is a way to create and foster activism amongst our students in a exponential way moving towards the future.
Okay, thank you. I noticed there are some young people out in the crowd. Are there any questions or comments that you would like to make? The microphone is open. Please don't be shy. I know the first question is always the toughest. Come on down. Thank you. I realized when I said, come on down, I sounded like Monty Hall and let's make a deal. Yeah.
Hey there. So I'm Asya Wallach. I'm a graduate of the school. 2014, Dr. Shem spoke at my graduation. It was lovely. Thank you. Neurology residency. Currently, I'm in fellowship here, and I'm just so happy to hear that you're also having a great time. I thought that some of the older physicians who spoke sounded so cynical and so unhappy with how the medical system is today. I thought that there was a little bit of a disconnect between how we view it, because I also feel like my program, not in medicine, neurology, does a wonderful job of building teams, making sure that we have a life outside of the hospital, making sure that we take good care of our patients. I also had a life outside of the hospital. I was able to have a baby in residency. I feel like that's not something that would have been as easy if I was spending my entire days within the walls of this place. And I guess the line that I keep thinking about from your book is the orthopedic height. I always like to bring the exam table up when I'm doing fundoscopic exams, and I always ask my patients to not start walking as soon as I'm done, because I'm terrified that one of them is going to fall and twist their ankle. So far, no one has, but I'm still young, so I know it's probably going to happen. And just thank you guys for chatting.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Anyone else like to make a comment? Come on down.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm a first year here at NYU. This question is mostly directed toward Eli, but anyone can feel free to answer. So I went to undergrad, and I was also a managing editor and a news writer and a columnist for my school paper, and I was involved with the literary journal, and I've done a little bit of publishing. But for Eli, how did you continue to do that in medical school, and because I noticed you kind of woven, you haven't kept them separate. You've kind of woven your education here with your writing and use that to find these opportunities to express yourself as a writer and as a physician or upcoming physician. So I guess if you have any advice about how to maintain that passion and the discipline to kind of continue writing.
Well, first of all, thank you for what you said. It's very kind. My first piece of advice with Christmas coming up is ask for an espresso machine. Really helpful. The second thing, which is a piece of advice that maybe I'm, doctoring, excuse the pun, from Dr. Oshinsky and another one of my mentors here, Dr. Class, is in a way you just sort of keep kicking until the door comes down. And you just keep plugging and have the vigilance and the perseverance to not give up. And I think, there's a lot of conversation about grit in terms of dealing with things that come unto you. I think maybe the converse is tenacity in terms of, bringing the pieces of yourself that you feel like are important outwards. And I think you keep pushing and you prioritize it, because there may be limitations on the hours that we're in the hospital, followed or not all the time. But there may be those limitations, but there's not a limitation on the knowledge that's out there to learn. And PubMed is there when you get home. It's there on the bus. It's there on subway. And there's a universe of things to know. And there's never gonna be enough time, I guess, in medical school. But at the same time, you can carve out space for the things that matter most to you. And I would encourage
Can
you
I
to
ask a quick follow-up? What are were there any important relationships, mentorships, or as you said, doors that you knocked on that kind of helped you get started?
Find yourself a really amazing supporting cast, I would say, actually. I think there are editors come and go, and but the people who don't are your family, your chosen family. Talk about connection. I'm as much siblings with my medical student peers, a couple of whom are here, as anyone else. And there were times when I said, I give up, like I'm waving the flag, and they said, don't, in a variety of ways, some with 4-letter words and some not. But use that, and also find mentors, right? Which is a horrific piece of advice because it means nothing, but it also means everything. And you find yourself the people in your lives who stick their neck out for you at odd hours of the day when they don't have to, and when certainly there are many other responsibilities that they have, and cultivate those relationships.
Kate?
Yeah, quick old-fashioned but practical advice. Buy a bunch of notebooks and keep them in your white coat pocket. You are going to have some of the most profound experiences of your life with the patients you take care of over the next few years and then into residency. And it's amazing how easy it is to let those slip from your mind because you continue to have more. And when I look back on scraps of paper I took and notes I took, I think, oh my God, what an incredible person that was, what an incredible interaction that was. This is a story I want to tell. Just keep track of that. Just give yourself lots of pens and notebooks. Thank you.
But always have a red pen too, so you can
Yes. If I give you one quick piece of advice, it's put pen to paper every chance you get. Let me tell you one anecdote that I recall, and I hope it's accurate. About 20 years ago, maybe longer, I was writing a book about Mississippi, and I was in Mississippi, and I was at some party in Oxford, Mississippi, and I was talking to a guy in the corner. He was a state legislator, and he told me that he wrote 1 page a day. He wanted to be a novelist, and he wrote 1 page a day. And I thought to myself, as I recall, that's great, and goodbye and good luck. And it was John Grisham.
Wow.
Okay?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So goodbye and good luck.
I think Stephen King had a rule where every morning he'd get up and write an hour. That's great.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a postdoc research fellow here, and happen to be a third-year medical resident at a different institution. My question is about how much do you attribute the success of coming out of a medical school or residency to the connectedness that we had spoken about earlier versus a matter of self-resiliency in being able to self-reflect and kind of pick apart your own weaknesses and trying to improve upon them?
Dustin, you want to handle that one?
Yeah.
You can go first.
Your question is which you think is more important to surviving medical school and residency?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you kind of chose those two different things, connection and then the idea of self-resiliency. I think one is dependent on the other. I think if you don't have strong connections and relationships, it's very difficult to have the resiliency and the ability to be self-reflective. And so I think I would advise both. I think the idea of trying to establish, in medical school, definitely a peer group, mentors who you can rely on for support. And I have to say, going out of your way to make connections with your patients, I think is incredibly fulfilling and provides the level of energy that then lets you get through difficult times. And therefore then you can be more resilient. I was just coming off inpatient wards a couple of weeks ago, and I had a patient with B-cell lymphoma who was a 75-year-old woman, was kind of in her bed and couldn't really move anywhere. And she's from Brooklyn, so she would always ask me on my first couple of days if we could go look at the East River, so she could go look at Brooklyn. And the day was busy, and I'm like, you want me to go take you to the East River? But then I just started doing it. So every afternoon I would take her in a wheelchair for 10 minutes, and we'd go sit and eat cookies and look at the East River. And it was great, and my whole afternoon went better, and I was efficient and fine. And sometimes taking time to do things that are deep connections with other people give you then the resiliency to be more effective in other parts of your life.
So I'll jump on that and say that you have to be a very resilient person in order to build connection. And that most of our lives, I find in my experience that most of my energy is devoted towards maintaining and improving my relationships and connections with others. And that resiliency is something that will be built upon by those connections and fostered by those connections, but you need to continually pay attention to both of them.
Eli?
Yeah, I think Dustin and Kate covered most of it. The anecdote that I have is, yeah, I mean, I think no one is strong enough independently. I think you alone are strong enough until the day you're not, and that's when you need people. And so I think you just accept that it's an impossibility. I think one fond memory I have on medicine is, every week we multiple times a week have rounds with the teaching attending that go for a couple hours, and it's sort of in the middle of their day. You have a million other things, and frankly, it's always the worst time whenever it is. That's the worst time of the day to have it. And this small group, we actually instituted what we called snack rounds after teaching rounds, where we would just sort of coded, not really tell anyone in particular where we were, but we would just go downstairs to the coffee shop for 15, 20 minutes, get snacks, buy whatever nonsense was there, catch up, give whoever that week needed a hug, and then go about our merry way. And I think it's finding moments like that that helped me.
Hi, I'm Adam Skolnick from cardiology. So I just wanted to make a comment and hear some reflections from the panel. I was at the Beth Israel as an intern and resident when another transition came about, not the electronic medical record, but work hour laws. So my intern year, there were really no work hour laws, and then during my second year of residency, they brought in work hour laws. And I think it really speaks to a lot of what you were talking about having time to reflect, whether it's snack rounds or other rounds. My intern year, we spent a lot of time in the cafeteria late at night having dinner, and at night we'd have liver rounds, and we'd have other, and we would have a lot of meals with our co-residents. And it was really a time to connect. By the time I got to be a second and third year resident, when there were work hour laws, it was much more of a rat race to just rush out of the hospital, get everything done so we weren't in violation of the work hour laws. So even though back then, Dr. Pincus, who was one of my inspirations at the BI, I remember he wrote an entire note in the chart that it was a patient who came in with this super therapeutic INR in the setting of taking warfarin, and his entire note, the entire documentation was broccoli to the bedside. Signed, Dr. Pincus. And think about how much more time we had back then when you could write a note like that and when you could have dinner with your colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I had a similar thought when I heard comments earlier on the other panel, is that yes, we have less hours, we technically are allowed to be at the hospital or have to be there, but we have a lot of expectation of what gets done during those hours. Also, some of our job is different, so I think, I'm not sure at what year this changed, but it used to be an intern's job also to draw labs, to do different types of tests, to maybe give certain things that we don't do. We have phlebotomists now. Like an intern doesn't do all the things that someone else used to do, but at the same time, when you're responsible for managing a patient's care and you require the computer to do that, it can make you have to sit there for a long time. So the actual amount of time you get with your colleagues is a lot less, and you have to be very deliberate about how you spend it. I think your point is excellent, that when they're, not saying that I want those days to come back when you could work that many hours, but it did allow you to have social relationships that you can't do now.
Thanks, Adam. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Elise Perlmutter. I'm on the faculty at George Washington University, where I trained, although I live here. I did my internship at Mount Sinai, and as well as a residency, and then some other fellowship at Columbia. And my question is this. So I came into medicine right after House of God in the early 80s, so it was really our Bible. And it's very heartening to hear this group of young, enthusiastic, and very, very smart medical students and doctors talk about the connections and how you take care of each other and do the things that are important to you, in addition to taking wonderful care of the patients that you so obviously are connected to. My question is that I have come across many young people of your era who have suicided from this institution, from Einstein, all in the last couple of years. So to me, that's kind of a disconnect. And what's happening in your education, in your programs now, to try to avoid that?
You guys want to talk about medical school first?
So here at NYU, we have a fantastic program called MD Aware, which is kind of like a checkpoint for our students throughout the entirety of their education. And we talk about anything and everything that is applicable to that period of time. So the upcoming MS2s, the second year as well, before we start our clerkships, we have an MD Aware session about uncertainty and how to face uncertainty in working with new staff, not knowing everything all the time, and being able to reconcile your identity as a student and your identity as a budding medical professional, and being able to bridge those gaps, I think, is very inherent to self-perception and your ability to continue on in a way that would be healthy and prevent negative outcomes and harm to yourself. So that's a fantastic program that we have here.
Kate?
Yeah, thank you for such an important question. So, I don't know enough about the data on suicides that happened prior to this era, and certainly don't know a lot about the reasons behind, for example, in the book, Potts suicide in that era versus reasons now. But I do imagine that there's probably some similarities. I think the themes communicated in the book are these feelings of guilt of having either not done enough for a patient or feeling so overwhelmed by your work or just completely ground down. I certainly think residents still feel those things now. Even if we work in a different system, I think we feel an immense responsibility towards our patients. And if things go wrong or if there's a ethically difficult situation, I think it can be very trying. That said, I feel very grateful that I'm in the internal medicine program and on the primary care track of that program. We have a lot of internal mechanisms of community building and support that allow us to be able to kind of vent feelings and frustrations to both small groups and larger groups in a way that allows us, I think, to process those feelings. And certainly I feel a sense of people looking out for one another. I don't know if I have a good explanation for why there are these cluster of suicides now. I imagine there's just different challenges, but still challenges to being a caretaker and a healer. I think being a physician, no matter at what level, is a very noble but very challenging job, having someone's life in your hands, and those stresses, even as our technology changes, I think probably are still similar stresses. So I don't have a good answer, but I will say, at least within the residency program, we have several different ways of providing community for one another, which has been helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for the question as well. It's something that it's really of the utmost importance. I mean, there's no reason that, the folks down in Florida probably said it best, but there's no reason that a certain kind of environment like a school should put you at risk of life. I think in terms of whether there's a relationship, I think the dose dependency of medical school to suicide and disproportionate risk of depression and mental symptoms of suicide is a tighter correlation than many things that we see in medicine. I think that's a tragic reality, but it's a reality. I don't think that anyone in particular to blame, or I don't think that there is any one person to blame. I think there are a variety of issues. My own feeling on it is to the extent that Roy had Chuck and Chuck had Roy, the ability for Roy to be there for Chuck and Chuck to be there for Roy is not there to the extent that the barriers are set. I mean, in NYU, we don't have barriers between the computers because that would require more space than there is in Bellevue. But there's when you're sitting on each other's laps, writing on your two different computers, I think there are certain barriers to just being there for one another, and I think that's where I worry the most. Is when you're at your worst is when you need people. You don't need cheerleaders as much as you need your budding physicians to intervene on you in those moments. And
Thank you. Yeah, final question or comment.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ben Tak. I'm an intern at a different hospital. So one of the things that I found is it's very difficult. We were talking about EMRs and 30 minutes, and the system kind of breeds us in a sense where one of our licensing exams demands that we visit a patient in 15 minutes and write a note in 10. And you need to pass that test to become a doctor, and you need to be able to be quick and efficient and in and out of that room and get everything you can as quickly as possible. And so I just wanted to ask, how do you guys deal with that sort of situation? I hear you take your patients to East River. I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I am. So just curious.
So I'll get the ball rolling just because I haven't yet had to encounter exams in that way yet. But I like to think of myself as a little bit of a radical, like to push the envelope as much as I can, as you can probably tell by my appearance. So I am somebody that I went to undergrad. Grades were very important, but as soon as I got here, it was more about the learning. And this is something that I try to disseminate to my classmates as much as possible, that yes, scores are important and they're very important to the standing of institution and the standing of the residency and program that you want to be a part of. But what's more important is the quality of the care that you're going to be delivering in the future to yourself, to your coworkers, and to your patients. And that is something that cannot start early enough, and this is the way that I perceive it. I'm not anticipating shooting for the stars with my scores, but I am shooting for the stars with how I deal with my classmates and with my coworkers.
yeah, I don't have a great answer other than that I was often late in clinic. There were a lot of rotations where the negative feedback that I got was my notes were not concise, or I spent too long in clinical interactions, and that potentially delayed clinic. And I'm sorry to people who were subject to that, but I think that was my form of micro advocacy, was spending the 3 minutes on the margin to make the connection that might, have the person take their Lasix or not, rather than have it fit tightly within the schedule, but compromise my beliefs and potentially care of patient.
I have outpatient and inpatient thoughts for you. So I think on an outpatient side, some good advice I got from one of my mentors was that when someone's becoming your patient, you do not have to solve everything in one visit. And I think what you do have to do in one visit is establish a good relationship with them at every visit, because then that allows for visits to go smoother, to actually find out information from the patient, to actually make progress with someone on their goals. And so I think if you, spend the time making the relationship, which doesn't need to take a long time, but focus on that. And then make sure you understand the patient's agenda of what their goals and desires are, and then kind of set expectations of how much can get done in a given time. It's not perfect, but I think those things have helped me to not go crazy. On the inpatient side, I think that residents just need to be a little more creative sometimes, and maybe attendings too. I do think that time management, if we just think outside the box of how we manage our time and don't just kind of inherit a system that's been given to us. Again, when I have my interns come in the morning, unless someone is super critical or ill, I actually ask them to just sit at the computer, get done all their pre-writing of notes and drafting, and then we just spend the morning, almost the whole morning, seeing people. And I think when you spend more time with patients, interestingly, you end up with less time at the computer because you've had time to think about things and to work through things in a way. You understand the plan in a clearer way. You kind of move faster and get things done more efficiently because you've spent more time with the patient, if that makes sense. I think it's better for everyone's health and well-being, the patient and you as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you all. We will take a break for about 15 minutes. There's food outside, and then we'll come back for the final session.
I was asked to make one announcement by the lovely police officer. So there is a bag at the Argo Tea, a satchel bag, and he wants to know if it belongs to anyone in this audience. So if it does, please go claim it.
Okay, thank you very much.